Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Escape from Alcatraz 1979, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. In the shadow of the steel gray tide, a place loomed like a monolith of punishment, swallowed by the cold embrace of the bay's swirling currents. Guards trudged along narrow walkways, their faces set like granite, aware that they stood sentinel over men who had nothing left but time and the constant hum of regret. Inside those damp cells, each clank of a lock and the metallic rattle of keys echoed like a reminder that freedom was a distant, almost mythic hallucination. Yet amid this chorus of confinement, one figure moved through the corridors with quiet determination. The prison's legend was written in its granite walls, its wind-swept rock jutting out like a sentinel against the fog. Within that world of razor wire and isolation, a new kind of story was about to unfold, a story where every footstep resonated with the promise of escape, the dark whisper of defiance that dared to shout across the gray expanse toward the mainland. Inside that fortress of solitude, the protagonist was more myth than man, a hardened felon whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. He had earned his reputation the hard way, through daring heists, narrow escapes, and a coded language of respect among prisoners and guards alike. But no matter the reputation, in this island prison it meant little, for every man here had tried and failed to outwit the tides. The guards watched him carefully, his gait steady, his eyes flickering like coals under a blanket of ash. He seemed to absorb the facility's every breath, every barred window, every clank of iron, turning each into a clandestine piece of a larger blueprint. And in those stolen glances, he imagined the cold water whipping around his body as he drifted across the bay, a silhouette dissolving into the horizon, carrying within him the promise of resurgence and new beginnings. His plan would not be forged in a day, for the blood and sweat of meticulous preparation would stain his fingertips long before they brushed the freedom beyond. Dawn arrived in muted hues of lavender and charcoal, the fog rolling in as if summoned for effect. Within the prison's mess hall, a tense ritual unfolded. The inmates shuffled in single file, trays clattering on steel tables, eyes flicking toward corners where whispers stirred like restless birds. The hum of the guards' patrols served as a metronome for the breakfast line, but amid the monotony, a figure stood out. His face calm, almost serene, as though he had already drifted beyond these walls. Each man here clung to a different dream. Some dared to hope for leniency, others for a glimpse of the outside world through prison bars, and a handful dared to imagine breaking free altogether. In that charged atmosphere, our hero scanned the room like a general assessing a battlefield, memorizing guard patterns, counting languid glances, and mapping every inch of the room's architecture onto a mental canvas. For him, every detail mattered. The slight shift in the warden's gaze, the thickness of the breeze curling through a cracked window, the precise moment when the sun pierced the gloom and cast elongated silhouettes across the floor. Each fragment of routine was a clue, a piece in the mosaic of escape. Later, in his cell, the man leaned close to the bars, his head tilting toward a tiny crack in the ceiling, a conduit to the world beyond. He had spent nights sketching maps on scraps of toilet paper, using a smuggled spoon as a compass. He had fashioned lengths of rope from torn bed sheets, braided with the precision of a sailor weaving lines against a storm. Every whispered conversation with fellow inmates, men who had nothing left but time, had been coded into the secret lexicon of tunnels and hiding places. In the hush of his confinement, he listened for the cadence of footsteps, the throb of the guards' boots on grouted floors, the metallic hum of overhead floodlights flickering as they cycled on and off. With each breath, he reconstructed his strategy, tightening invisible knots around every variable. The tides, the guard rotation, the frigid bite of seawater, the timing of the ferry's passage. In the tight intimacy of darkness, the world outside felt like the dying echo of a dream, and he vowed to chase it down until every chain fell away. As dusk descended, cloaking the yard in uneasy shadows, the prison's routine shifted into a nocturnal ballet. The inmates made their way to a tiny courtyard where moonlight slashed through razor wire. Beneath the hollow gaze of the guard tower, he curled himself beside a stack of lumber pilfered from the workshop, each piece destined to become a weapon or a tool in his ruthless ballet of escape. His cellmate, a stocky man with haunted eyes, had fed him news from the world beyond these fences, snippets of newspaper smuggled by sympathetic guards. They were fragments of a life he hardly remembered, anecdotal reminders of families, friends, and a city pulsing with opportunities. Yet none of that would matter unless he conquered the churning currents that surrounded the island. Over the clank of the gate closing for the night, he whispered to himself a litany of everything he had ever learned: how to hold his breath for minutes at a time, how to judge the undertow's power by the shifting hue of water, how to endure the sting of cold salt water peeling at bare skin. These lessons, he knew, would become the difference between life and a corpse floating off the crags. And so, as the last guard's flashlight beam vanished into the black, he fortified his mind for what lay ahead. In the cramp of his cell, the hero guarded his tools like a hawk. When the lights flickered off, signaling lockdown, he let his hands move, chipping away at the rivets holding his cell's latch. Much of the craft was improvised. Pieces of metal, smuggled from the workshops, fashioned into makeshift chisels, hidden beneath a thin bunk mattress even as guards stomped along the corridor outside. There was a brutal poetry to those hours. Each shaven fragment of metal, each flicker of sweat, each soft click of progress felt like a step closer to redemption. He imagined the night as an accomplice. Its ink-dark shroud would cloak him as he slipped through shadows, evading the watchful towers. When at last the latch snapped, the world seemed to exhale with him. The heavy click of metal against metal echoed like a punch of defiance against the institution itself. In that hush, he rose, chest heaving, and stepped into the corridor, a narrow tunnel of dim yellow light, as though each breath could carry him 1,000 miles away from these walls. Beyond the corridor lay the warden's office, a room glossed in polished wood and old-fashioned photographs of past warden portraits. He moved with the surreal grace of a ghost as he retrieved a stolen uniform from a side closet, sliding the crisp coat over his shoulders like a new skin. The badge was a stolen trinket, purchased through a cell-block network that traded favors and contraband. Putting it on felt like stepping into history. He felt the weight of injustice settle on his chest, a reminder that power, once usurped, belonged to him alone. The desk lamp in the warden's office glared like a judgmental eye as he straightened his uniform, brushing dust from the brass buttons with a steadiness he hardly felt. Against the dark backdrop of the outside world, it was a costume of illusion. One wrong move, one misplaced button, and the guard shift would see through it. But he had honed his performance, a nod here, a steady gaze there, to mimic the subtle confidence of those who held authority. In the mirrored window, he practiced the direct stare that spoke of command, silently promising to be the heaviest shadow in the prison yard tonight. In the hushed watch of pre-dawn, he strolled among the sleeping guards, each nod and half-smile a calculated note in his symphony of deception. The smell of stale coffee and machine oil hung in the air as he brushed past cells, his uniform a silent passport to anywhere within this fortress. His first stop was the recreation yard, an open expanse of cracked concrete beneath a scaffold of razor wire, ghostly under the soft glow of early lamplight. With an expert hand, he stacked his carved rope of bed sheets in a careful coil behind the corner of a block of metal. He knew he had a narrow window before the sun's first rays or the guard's midday rounds might reveal his secret. Every second tensed him like a drawn wire. And yet, when he finally stepped away from that coil of salvation, slipping over the fence with a choreographed agility that bordered on artistry, he felt a lightness he had not known since childhood, like a drowning man discovering precious air. The next stage of his exodus lay in the prison's labyrinthine tunnel system, smoky gray veins burrowing beneath the island's rock. Each brick was coarse with salt deposits, each beam overhead dripped condensation that fell into puddles like hastening footsteps. The path was as dark as spilled ink, lit only by a single flashlight that cut a cone of yellow into the void. He navigated these tunnels with the precision of a cartographer, passing markers he had left weeks earlier, tiny flecks of chalk grain against the damp walls. He had learned the subterranean sewer system's map by heart, Every junction, every sloping drain, every rat-chewed grate. In those heartbeats, between shadows and the distant rumble of the bay, he felt both godlike and vulnerable. Godlike for breathing free in a world of unseen roads, vulnerable for knowing that one misstep could plunge him into blackness or drown. His lungs felt primed for the deep vaults of air that lay ahead, the stench of salt water intensifying as the tunnel dipped lower, leading him closer to the final breach emerging from those cavernous depths. He arrived at the subterranean chamber where the final barrier to the bay waited, a steel grate, rusted and coated in years of guilt. His makeshift tools, all sharpened nails and metal scraps, felt like hammers in his fist as he levered the grating open. Water rushed in like a furious exclamation, a muted roar that felt strangely like applause. He cast a glance behind him. Through the darkness, he saw the faint glow of the prison's grid above, then chose his path through the murky current, the ache in his muscles forgotten in the face of possibility. The cold water curled around his ankles, rose to his knees, and finally enveloped his waist, each step against the unseen pull of the tide a testament to his resolve. As he surfaced into the hush of the deep water, that icy barrage became the final gauntlet, the threshold between captivity and the myriad possibilities of freedom. His lungs bulged as he forced breath into his body. The salt stung his eyes, the current tugged at his arms, but in that moment he felt more alive than he had since first heard the human laugh on the mainland. The final leg of his journey lay across the tumultuous expanse of the bay. Waves slapped against his back like desperate hands trying to pull him under. He learned from whispered legends that few had tried this crossing and even fewer had glimpsed the other side. Each stroke was a prayer against the darkness, a conversation with hope as murky as the depths below. Behind him, the prison's outline faded into the night, Gothic towers swallowed in shadow. Ahead, on the distant shore, the faint glimmer of lights from the city promised warmth and anonymity. As he fought the brutal tug of the current, the roar of the water seemed to shift into something almost like a heartbeat, slow, powerful, unstoppable. In that unending rhythm, he found a strange companionship with the bay itself, as though the very water conspired to carry him toward salvation. Though his lungs quaked with the sting of cold and exertion, his mind soared above the waves, sketching visions of a world where his name would no longer be whispered in fear, where the tides had finally turned in his favor. Hours passed, or perhaps moments, for time dissolved in the cauldron of raw survival, until at last he waded through a final crest of foam onto crowded rocks stained by gull guano. His chest heaved with ragged relief as he looked back, the prison's lights blotted out by the night sky, its fabled walls swallowed by distance. A toll of that first gasp of clean air felt like a benediction. He had danced at the edge of death and emerged, reshaped by every brush with despair. Ahead, the city's roar gathered in volume. Honking cars, indistinct chatter, the drone of neon, but he savored the carries of sound as if they were a symphony composed for him alone. Eyes stinging with salt water, he pressed his hand to his chest as though he could feel his heart pounding beneath the bone like a drum heralding new life. In the hush of dawn's early glow, he took a final, unwavering step away from the shore that had once loomed like a cage, and toward the uncertain promise of renewed destiny. Emerging from those cavernous depths, he arrived at the subterranean chamber where the final barrier to the bay waited, a steel grate, rusted and coated in years of guilt. His makeshift tools, all sharpened nails and metal scraps, felt like hammers in his fist as he levered the grating open. Water rushed in like a furious exclamation, a muted roar that felt strangely like applause. He cast a glance behind him. Through the darkness, he saw the faint glow of the prison's grid above, then chose his path through the murky current, the ache in his muscles forgotten in the face of possibility. The cold water curled around his ankles, rose to his knees, and finally enveloped his waist, each step against the unseen pull of the tide a testament to his resolve. As he surfaced into the hush of the deep water, that icy barrage became the final gauntlet, the threshold between captivity and the myriad possibilities of freedom. His lungs bulged as he forced breath into his body. The salt stung his eyes, the current tugged at his arms, but in that moment he felt more alive than he had since first heard the human laugh on the mainland. The final leg of his journey lay across the tumultuous expanse of the bay. Waves slapped against his back like desperate hands trying to pull him under. He learned from whispered legends that few had tried this crossing and even fewer had glimpsed the other side. Each stroke was a prayer against the darkness, a conversation with hope as murky as the depths below. Behind him, the prison's outline faded into the night, Gothic towers swallowed in shadow. Ahead, on the distant shore, the faint glimmer of lights from the city promised warmth and anonymity. As he fought the brutal tug of the current, the roar of the water seemed to shift into something almost like a heartbeat, slow, powerful, unstoppable. In that unending rhythm, he found a strange companionship with the bay itself, as though the very water conspired to carry him toward salvation. Though his lungs quaked with the sting of cold and exertion, his mind soared above the waves, sketching visions of a world where his name would no longer be whispered in fear, where the tides had finally turned in his favor. Hours passed, or perhaps moments, for time dissolved in the cauldron of raw survival, until at last he waded through a final crest of foam onto crowded rocks stained by gull guano. His chest heaved with ragged relief as he looked back, the prison's lights blotted out by the night sky, its fabled walls swallowed by distance. A toll of that first gasp of clean air felt like a benediction. He had danced at the edge of death and emerged, reshaped by every brush with despair. Ahead, the city's roar gathered in volume. Honking cars, indistinct chatter, the drone of neon, but he savored the carries of sound as if they were a symphony composed for him alone. Eyes stinging with salt water, he pressed his hand to his chest as though he could feel his heart pounding beneath the bone like a drum heralding new life. In the hush of dawn's early glow, he took a final unwavering step away from the shore that had once loomed like a cage, and toward the uncertain promise of renewed destiny. Material shortages plagued every hopeful plan. Razor-sharp implements were forbidden, but a convicted handyman had smuggled a small spoon from the mess hall's kitchen. In his hand, that spoon could gouge steel if wielded patiently, like carving bone from flesh. Day upon day, he knelt in his narrow cell, pressing the spoon's edge into the cell bars, coaxing steel to splinter along invisible seams. His fingers bled, his wrist ached, and yet he persisted, each shiver of metal beneath the spoon a tremor of triumph. He hid bent lengths of metal beneath his bunk, each one eventually fashioned into a crude yet effective tool. Meanwhile, other prisoners carefully swapped pieces of cloth from worn-out shoes to craft a makeshift rope. They bled the laces, frayed coarse cotton, and then wove the shredded strips into a cord they estimated could bear a man's weight. The process spanned months, each frayed thread a lesson in patience and a moment when despair threatened to eclipse their resolve. As the luster of gathering tools took shape, the plan's outline solidified in their gaunt hearts. They would exploit the laundry corridor, a narrow passage saturated with steam and shadows that no guard ever entered. At precisely midnight, when the chapel clock's distant chime had long faded, they would slip from their cells, each step measured against the dull hum of quiet alarms. In the laundry room, they would don spare guard uniforms, each stitch of fabric a borrowed identity. Under that disguise, they would wet the prisoner's forged identification card they had obtained from a warden's desk, one that spelled a name unlit by suspicion. From there, they would saunter down the pier to a waiting rowboat, its oars swaying gently as waves splashed along the dock pilings. They would skirt the light of the dock, slip into the dark embrace of churning water, and let the current carry them to a channel where the mainland's distant glimmers thrummed like a promise. Yet key events threatened to unravel their tapestry of hope. The routine inspection caught one man with a coil of ragged cloth in his skirt hem, triggering a lockdown that slammed iron bars with ear-splitting finality. Guards roamed the corridors in packs, shining flashlights into every shadow. The young con who carried messages from cell to cell, his sneakers scuffed and his heart pounding, felt his blood turn to ice when a guard's boot heel cracked within inches. Distant curses from his cellmate urged him to remain calm until the search squad passed. For an agonizing hour, they flunked through every cell, every squat tunnel, only to miss evidence stashed behind crates where the man who carved spoons into daggers crouched in the darkness. Later, whispers floated through the bars. One guard suspected tunnels, another insisted it was fantasy. This skirmish of suspicion reaffirmed their cautious optimism. Each guard's doubt was a chink in the system's iron armor. In between these tests, the daily grind resumed. The clatter of the mess hall, the grind of metal keys, the swing of cell doors, each element knitted them closer in purpose. The scrap metal spooner pressed on, his gums tender from the strain of holding metal shards every night. Within the echoing laundry room, the leader rehearsed body language to mimic a guard, how to tilt the head in a casual greeting, how to let eyes linger a moment too long on a fellow watcher as though they were sharing a private joke. He and his confederate practiced walking posture under the dim glow of the bulb, each step an echo of authenticity. They timed themselves, seconds crunched beneath their soles as echoes ricocheted across tiled floors. Their confidence swelled like a wave threatening to break, a surge ignited by each successful shard removed, each cloth frayed, each guard's nod of unearned camaraderie in passing. As the weeks folded into months, the escape blueprint grew more precise. Under every junction of ductwork and every seam in the wall, they imagined hidden caverns where they could stash small treasures, tiny hammers, a rope made of tattered sheets, a fragment of cloth on which they had scrawled a crude map. Yet beneath their careful craft lurked anxiety. Any stray word, any half-shielded flicker of action could dispatch suspicion like a searing beam to smother their efforts. When their nearest neighbor heard metal delaminating from the bars overhead, he clicked his spoon against the grate to signal all clear, a Morse code that flashed hope through the absolute black. The clang of distant pots and pans from the kitchen masked their digging, lulling the guards into believing the usual cacophony was the only crime on that island. Through it all, they sustained themselves on the notion that human will, once tuned to persistence, becomes a blade that splits stone. In the pre-dawn hush of winter's chill, the plan tiptoed toward its first great test, cracking the pipe behind the inmate washbasins, a critical juncture in the corridor's labyrinth. For weeks, they had observed guard rotations. When one group shuffled to chow, another circled the yard, and they knew the window of opportunity would be fewer than 3 minutes. At precisely 3:47 a.m., the leader slipped from his bunk, his identity concealed beneath a guard's jacket stolen from the laundry hook. He edged along the corridor, every breath measured as though each would betray him. When he reached the wash-basin, the spoon-turned agile tool slid into a small seam of pipe, each minute motion shivering beneath the surface of cold metal. As sparks of friction lit the dark like fireflies, he felt the Christian promise of resurrection stirring in his veins, believing that every scrap of resolve could resurrect freedom from within the island's deepest crypt. When the seal finally gave, a muted hiss of released steam swirled around him, as though the island exhaled at the imminence of betrayal. In that hiss, the water below that labyrinthine grid trembled with cracked pipes, ready to flood the laundry tunnel. He felt a moment's rush, the fear that alerted his mind in neon flash. If the pipe collapsed too quickly, floodwaters would drown them. If it held too long, guards might trace the leak and flood the entire corridor. In the split second the pipe hissed its surrender, the leader extracted his spoon, tucked it into his coat, and melded into the corridor's shadows. The next moment, the guards hustled through, clipped flashlights carving waves into the steam, their boots splashing through rivulets leading from the washbasin. Yet the man, cloaked in an unearned guard's uniform, blended smoothly enough that one guard assumed he was simply a wanderer trapped behind schedule. When asked his business, he keyworded a benign excuse, troubleshooting a supposed maintenance issue, before slipping away with the confidence of a phantom. That crack in the pipe marked a turning point. From that moment, they knew the laundry corridor lay vulnerable to a tidal surge, but the risk had to be balanced with precision. Flour powder mixed into tap water painted a map of dried chalk across the floor, tracing the hidden contours of tunnels beneath concrete. They had scavenged years' worth of trade secrets from old maps and scrap references, tiny printouts they had smuggled from the library when a guard let down his guard. The final arc of that plan required not only metal carving and rope braiding but also a practiced facility with human performance, speaking in clipped cadences, matching the slanted gaze of a guard patrolling narrow hallways, and walking as though these corridors belonged to them. They had to become ghosts who wore uniforms as masks, faint reminders that authority could be assumed by anyone who knew its shape and cadence. As word spread among sympathetic inmates who had no role in the escape itself, A quiet camaraderie surged through the cell block. Men slipped letters of encouragement through the grating, sealed in envelopes crafted from smuggled newspaper and waxed cellophane. Those letters carried more than ink. They carried the knowledge that when one man dared to defy Alcatraz's iron grip, the island itself threatened to blink, and perhaps, for the first time, taste vulnerability. Guards scowled at these exchanges, scanning every envelope as though it might conceal contraband. Yet no guard could peer into the heart of a man poised to rewrite his destiny. When the leader returned to his bunk, he found beneath his pillow a scrap of lace, a small pendant carved into the shape of a sailing ship, a gift from his cellmate who had no part in the plan but believed fiercely in the power of possibility. That night, that tiny object gleamed beneath the meager glow of the cell's single bulb, reflecting a flicker of renewed determination that set every step and every breath aflame. And so the first half of this story unfolds. A tale of whispered strategies under dim lamps, of metal chisels groaning against steel bars, of shadows moving across tunnels as though time itself crawled its way to freedom. Each split hinge and furtive glance sketches the blueprint of a man destined to rewrite his fate, but also a man burdened by the weight of hundreds of eyes watching for so much as a slip. Their whole world is measured in inches of steel, every breath counted, yet each heartbeat marked the distance to new horizons. In the flickering tapestry of barbed wire and mist-enshrouded waters, a quiet revolution simmered, a whisper that one defiant soul, armed with cunning and courage, could bend the granite spine of Alcatraz itself and step beyond island's edge into dawn's uncertain promise. Above the sleeping island, the dawn sky unfurled like a gray sheet, stretching thin over silent stone. As the first hint of day seeped through barred windows, a hush settled across the cell block. Men rose on creaking bunks, bleary-eyed and blinking against the dim glow, as though caught between the world they once knew and the one they were desperate to reclaim. Somewhere beyond the walls, the fairies hummed a lonely refrain, the tide brushing against the island's granite edges with whispering insistence. Now, more than ever, each heartbeat brimmed with urgency, an electric pulse that threaded through every muscle and bone. For the three men who had spent weeks chiseling, planning, and scheming in secret shadows, the horizon had shifted from a distant dream to a blink away from reality. When the guards clattered past the cells on their early morning rounds, the three men lay still upon their cots, each draped in a borrowed uniform that felt heavy with the weight of their ambitions. In the faint glow of a single overhead lamp, they moved like spectres, silent as whispers, guided only by the contours of their plan. One slipped from the mattress, his bare feet meeting the cold concrete with the softest exhale of breath. Another followed, tracing the map of the corridor in his mind, recalling each turn, each shadowed alcove. The third crouched near the heavy lattice of metal bars that separated the tiers of cells, his heart pounding like a war drum as he inserted the makeshift key into the lock, a spoon bent into an improbable shape that felt more like poetry in metal than a practical tool. The lock's stubborn resistance yielded at last with a faint click, a small victory that echoed louder than any victory could in that cavernous space. They stood in the corridor, a line of darkness against the pale of dawn, and exchanged a brief nod. No words needed, for every man there knew the stakes. One reached into his jacket and retrieved a ragged coil of cloth, the rope they had woven from tattered sheets and threads, braided into a length that would be tested by every tide and current between them and redemption. Their route would take them through the laundry room, then beyond the kitchen where steam cocooned the air, through a tangle of pipes and vaults into the bowels of the island where the tunnels wound like secret veins. Each step was rehearsed 100 times in the silence of their cells, the precise moment to slip past the guard in the laundry, the subtle tilt of the head to mimic authority as they passed under the watchful towers. In that blessed span before sunrise, they took measured strides toward the door that would either lead them to life or drag them back into the clanging jaws of despair. The laundry-room door groaned on its hinges as they slipped inside, enveloped by the scent of damp fabric and thermal machinery. Steam billowed around iron washers, a ghostly haze that made the room feel both suspended and urgent. A lone guard, cradling a clipboard, brushed past them without a second glance, their uniforms flawless, their posture rock-solid. Hearts thundered as they passed the rows of industrial dryers, each one humming like a watchful eye. They pressed themselves against crates stacked high with linens, breathing in unison with the rhythmic click of the guard's boots as he moved away. Once the corridor beyond lay empty, they exhaled the held breath, though their lungs burned, whispering thanks to the silent gods of fortune. From there, they navigated a narrow chute leading to the kitchens, sidestepping a night cook busy preparing the day's first batches of oatmeal. The stovetops glowed like embers, spitting steam as pots clanked together, each clang a clarion call that might have drowned out the sound of their hearts had it not matched their vehemence. They paused behind a counter, the cook's apron covered back a temporary shield. They watched the cook's movements with the same rapt attention one might reserve for a losing card game, scanning the yard's shifting patterns, tracking the wash line's tremors in a breeze they could not feel, mapping every guard step in the corridor just beyond the swinging door. Once the cook disappeared down the hallway, they crept into the subterranean corridor. A dim tunnel snakes through the island, its walls slick with condensation and fragments of secrets too long confined. Faint drips echoed in the darkness, as though the island itself was confessing to some unseen crime. They reached the hidden grate that birthed the final leg of their odyssey, a passage into water, cold and unforgiving. One by one, they leaned over, loosening the rusted hinges with a spoon that felt more alive in their grip than any knife. The grate released with a metallic groan, and water hissed as it flooded the chamber like steam from a dying engine. In that hissing overture, they felt an electric thrill. The world beyond had never seemed so close, nor so arduously earned. They abandoned their borrowed uniforms on the damp concrete, pooled in a wet crease as though the island had exhaled them. In the final act of transformation, they tied the braided rope to an overhead pipe, looping its end together with every trembling fray accounted for. The tallest of the trio clipped his fingers around the rope's end, testing its yield as though it were the lifeline to a distant star. As he swung, his boots splashed into the icy water, the drop sending a shock of cold pain coursing from his toes to his chest. The current carried him with a glacial insistence, yanking him into a carriage lane of darkness that threatened to twist limbs, to reel spinal cords into banshee cries. Yet he pressed on, relentless as a machine, strokes symmetrical and deliberate, until the second man followed his cue, and then the third. In the watery amphitheater beneath Alcatraz, the bay's icy grasp felt like a sentence authored by the fates themselves. Each stroke was a whisper of disobedience, each breath a victory snatched from the jaws of oblivion. They fought the undertow's tug, that invisible tether that demanded tribute for every inch of progress. As they reached the mouth of a culvert buried beneath the shoreline, they took shelter in its sheltered arc, grabbing hold of the jagged rocks there as though they were hands extended in silent benediction. Their lungs tore with the coolness of the air as they sucked breath, their veins crackling with the promise of dawn quietly igniting on the horizon. In that narrow inlet, the second wave of action unfolded. Each man retrieved a makeshift flotation device, a waterlogged jerrycan smuggled from the kitchen storeroom, a coil of sheet that barely supported a single foot before shredding. They strapped these vessels to their waistlines and waded back into the bay's icy expanse, the water now lapping at their shoulders, the currents contorting their movements like marionettes in a cruel puppet show. Yet the further from the island they swam, the more the currents lost their teeth, the more the world beyond whispered its welcome. The sun's first rays cracked the sky in a pale apocalyptic glow, splintering into motes upon the water's surface. And with that light came birdsong, distant gull calls that seemed to herald a triumph more profound than any they had ever known. Across the bay, the prison stood as an unattainable monolith, its once imposing silhouette now a ghost misted by dawn's light. Upon reaching the whispering shallows of Angel Island, each man clambered onto rocks wet with seaweed and tossed by small waves. They lay upon those stones, chests heaving, dreams bursting behind their eyeballs, as though even the world itself took a breath with them in relief. In that moment, the rancid stench of chlorinated water and salt clung to their skin like a second layer, a reminder that survival was always a bargain with agony. As they pressed their palms against cool rock, they felt the gentle cradle of land beneath them, the solid promise of the world's promise that, beyond the chill and the flagstones of Alcatraz, second chances awaited. They stayed there long enough to forage for passage beyond the island, searching through pockets for crumpled tooth checks, for pocket coins to fuel the ferry docked beyond the cove. One found a map printed on thin paper, an outline of the bay, crinkled and more precious than anything they carried. The map's jagged lines traced threads between islands, docks, and piers, a scarlet thread beckoning them across the unknown. Yet as they stood to follow that red trail, a pair of foghorns bellowed through the quiet like warning bell claps. They froze, a moment of panic seizing their muscles, before realizing it was just the morning ferry on its routine route to the mainland. Amid that bellow, their pulse soared with the knowledge that fate still held its breath for them in every sound. Within hours, they crisscrossed ferry ramps in woolen coats pilfered from suitcases washed up on the sand, remnants of other lives, of voyages they'd never take. They paid the token fee, the metal clinking in the fare box beneath the slick glare of neon signs, and boarded with a half-dozen morning commuters who glanced at them with nodding eyes, smelling salt and wanting nothing more. The ferry's engines shuddered to life, lifting them from the clench of island misery. As they stepped from the craft onto the beaten wharves of the city, the chorus of honking cars and shuffling heels welcomed them, a cacophony that felt compassionate, a light so bright it threatened to blind them after so many nights swallowed by granite and steel. Having set foot on the mainland, they gambled nothing. They carried themselves with the calm of men who had stared death in the eye and made it blink. Each took directions to separate corners of the city, casting away the remnants of prison garb, uniform jackets tossed into dumpsters, battered shoes tossed onto cobblestones, each discarded piece an offering to oblivion. They vanished into the bustle. One became a ghost among morning market patrons, another melted into the steel halls of construction sites, and the third found refuge in a battered taxi that careened through narrow streets as dawn's pale glow shattered the world's edges. Yet their story did not end with the tugboat's retreat or their footprints in the city's pavement. Behind the scenes, a silent storm brewed. Guards on the island discovered the infirmity of their fortress when the first report of the escape flashed across the warden's desk, a stark, urgent cable that named each man and the approximate hour of their disappearance. Red lights pulsed on the phones in the control room, and guards in the towers scanned the horizon for silhouettes, radio chatter forming a knot of panic and confusion. Within days, the city's papers ran headlines in swelling fonts, 3 prisoners vanish from Secure Island, and editorial boards were alight with debates about the prison's infallibility. Meanwhile, the 3 men, free but not yet safe, found themselves in a race against the tides of suspicion and law enforcement. One man took refuge with a distant cousin who ran a small tavern in a quiet suburb, sharing stories of a brother lost to gambling who might have skewed toward desperation but never lacked the cunning to survive. Night after night, he scrubbed the salt from his skin in the warmth of that cousin's sink, while the door's lock clicked whenever a stray footstep wavered outside. Another found work as a laborer on a freighter bound for foreign ports, his muscle and silent fortitude making him indispensable, though every ship's horn felt like a tolling knell reminding him that bounty hunters roamed the seas for men like him. The third drifted into a monastery, doing menial chores for monks who regarded him with quiet, measured kindness. Yet even behind stained glass windows, his heart raced with the need to keep moving, to prove that freedom was a horizon forever shifting, never receding beyond memory. As their scattered destinies took shape, the legend of their escape blossomed. In the prison's hush, rumors swelled like waves. Some spoke of their demise in the frigid waters, their bodies swallowed by currents and never recovered. Others whispered that they had vanished into shadowy criminal networks, resurfacing only to slip away when dawn's guard turned. Newspapers peddled speculative sketches, rendered faces of the fugitives lined up like playing cards, each marked "Wanted." Posters plastered on lampposts along the coast bore their mugshots, and beneath each likeness, a bounty number flickered like a candle in the wind. In private circles, the more cynical scoffed at their triumph, while the romanticized murmured odes to defiance. Why should any man be shackled by stone when the tides themselves offered passage? Weeks crawled into months, and still the men eluded capture. Wherever they roamed, amid grain shipments on freighters, within factories' iron clatter, hidden in the hush of rural chapels, they shifted identities like rivers change their course. Each day bore its own set of narrow margins. the risk of recognition from a quick-glance magazine photograph, the insurance of changing locales before grudges hardened into manhunts, the perpetual recalibration of faces and voices so that his own name would ring strange in conversations. They rebuilt their lives in the margins of society. One worked as an unheralded cook in a small diner miles from San Francisco's Glimmer. Another served as a hardscrabble lumberjack in a forested valley, learning the language of trees so that no human ear could decipher his accent, and the third lived in transient motels by railroad tracks, hauling sacks of coal that kept the train's furnace ablaze. Each night, as their bodies ached with labor's toll, they dreamed not of gold nor accolades, but of the whisper of waves on their sleeves, the memory of that first gulf of water that carried them from darkness into day. And so their story wound itself into the fabric of local lore, neighbors telling their children that these men were ghosts incarnate, that once you walked among shadows, the world blurred before your eyes. Yet despite the police's fervent search and the relentless press's hunger for headlines, the men's chosen shadows clung to them like a skin of invisibility. Each had stitched a new life from the remnants of desperation and will, threads coiled tight around the promise that no prison, no matter how formidable, could contain a man determined to dance with tides and defy their pull. In the hush before a cold dawn on Angel Island, the tide stirred with memories of 3 men who slipped from stone jaws into the sea's own custody. Somewhere on shore, difference began to be reshaped, a thread of carpet in a wood-paneled diner, the scent of pine dust on an axe-handle, the hum of a monastic chant wafting across stone floors. Yet behind each new horizon glimmered the original adventure, the clatter of a spoon carving steel, the hiss of steam flooding a grim corridor, the toil of bare limbs in frozen water, and the hush of city lights welcoming defiance, however fleeting. In the echoes of that defiance, the island itself seemed to tremble, its granite bulk a silent promise that no fortress of stone could ever vanquish the fierce breath of freedom. Even in the hollow hush of impending confinement, his eyes held a steady intelligence, as though he had already measured every inch of his world and found it wanting. Frank Morris arrived on the island with a reputation carved in whispers, an inmate whose cunning had slipped through lesser locks and whose mind twisted puzzles into patterns of escape. Beneath the brim of a worn fedora, the lines at the corner of his eyes suggested both years of weary scrutiny and a spark of restless resolve. He carried himself as though the world, its cold corridors, graded crossings, and concrete barricades, was simply a set of obstacles to be understood, diagnosed, and, if necessary, transcended. At night, when the island's dim lights flickered against granite walls, he would lie on his bunk, tracing the shadows cast by barred windows with a silent counting of seconds. To Frank, each mark on the wall, each groan of a cast-iron door, seemed to offer a note in a larger symphony, one he intended to conduct with an unwavering baton. Yet while his mind charted blueprints and riddles, his demeanor remained controlled, almost serene. He spoke sparingly, his voice low and measured, a cadence that hinted at careful thought rather than idleness. Fellow inmates listened when he spoke, as though his words carried an undercurrent of purpose. Guards watched him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, fascination at how a man could wear his quiet as armor. In the recreation yard, Frank's gaze would drift to the gunmetal horizon of water, a boundary that both separated him from freedom and beckoned with possibility. Even when engaged in casual conversation, he showed a tendency to tilt his head as though absorbing more than mere words, taking in the subtlest tremor of tone, the slightest shift in posture, the unspoken confessions that revealed the creaking hinges of the mind. This attentiveness carved a space around him, a zone of quiet authority that invited confidences yet offered nothing in return. He was a man of few needs, a functional cell, a small stack of paperbacks to keep the mind nimble, and the freedom to think beyond his walls. John Anglin arrived surrounded by the weight of his brother's presence, a man whose shoulders bore not only his own past but the collective ambition of a family. He had a rough-hewn grace, a lean frame honed by years of labor and furtive flights from lesser jails. His eyes burned with a smoldering intensity that gave the impression of someone who had fought fights no one believed he could survive. He carried a stamp from the bank robbery record etched into his hardened heart, a need to outrun expectation, to show the world that no lock, no guard, no institution could contain him. In the corridors, John's gait suggested both a warrior's poise and the suspicion of a hunted animal, always listening, always calculating. He shared a bunk with Frank, drawn by stories of the man's intellect, his uncanny ability to turn imprisonment into a chessboard. Yet partnership with Frank was not mere convenience. It stemmed from a kinship of exile, a tacit understanding that the island's stone walls could only hold them if they allowed themselves to be caged, mind and body. Working alongside him, his brother Clarence bore a gentler gravitas, soft edges that belied a steel-like fortitude. His features, though more open and amenable than John's, held a quiet melancholy, the imprint of sacrifice and loss. Where John's ambition set his gaze ablaze, Clarence's resilience lent his eyes a somber depth. He moved through the cell block with purposeful humility, engaging guards with an almost apologetic politeness, absorbing their questions as though gauging the extent of their distraction. In the chapel, where contraband hymns whispered among massing believers, his posture suggested a reverence that transcended faith. It was a reverence for the brother he had vowed to follow beyond any horizon. When they met, John and Clarence exchanged nods that needed no words, gestures steeped in half-formed promises that no tide-proof challenge, would ever quench. They shared a language built not of letters but of acute recognition. Each crease in the other's brow spoke of shared childhood runs through crowded streets, of late-night confessions whispered under cracked ceilings, of teenage dreams shaped by scarcity and smog. Behind the cold chain-linked dialogues of prison life, the warden loomed like an arbiter of fate, a man of Standard Oil lineage, his lineage as gilded as the name he bore yet steeped in the conviction that order was salvation. His shoulders were broad behind a crisp uniform, his chin set like a slab of marble carved to enforce compliance rather than empathy. Each morning, he strode through the cell block's core, inspecting faces as though evaluating machinery, susceptible to rust but otherwise unyielding. To him, inmates were not men but variables in an experiment, a contest to see whose will would bend first. In his office, which smelled faintly of leather and unshared secrets, he kept a ledger of infractions, cross-referenced with psychological profiles gleaned from academic psychologists who saw nothing more than case studies. Where guards enforced with cold routine, the warden strategized with cold intellect, orchestrating each aspect of the island's regime to ensure its reputation as the inescapable fortress, a beacon of deterrence that far outshone any earthly flame of hope. His hands, when clasped behind his back, bore a sting of latent tension, as though at any moment he might choose to enforce his will personally, refusing to delegate the physical violence he regarded as necessary for order's maintenance. Captain, by contrast, wore a uniform that seemed too large for his slender frame, an ill-fitting drapery over a man who seemed more dispirited than defiant. His face was etched with a sorrow that radio-static fleetingly transmitted down corridors. Rumor held that he was once a brilliant young officer with ideals as sharp as bayonets, but circumstances had gnawed at his spirit. Now, each time he scowled at a forged recipe scrawled on a stolen card, his eyes flickered with regret, as though a knife had severed part of him on that first day he allowed fear to override compassion. He carried a lanyard of keys like a gaudy scepter of hollow authority, jangles that became a constant reminder of the gulf between who he was and who he used to aspire to be. In the warden's presence he was dutiful, his head a pendulum of stoic compliance. Yet when the warden's back was turned, he lingered in the shadows of the aisles, studying the faces of men who seemed to live in a realm just beyond his reach, humanity unharnessed by the petty expectations that had once bound him. Within these rigid hierarchies, each character's world orbited around the forge of confinement. Frank navigated it with the fervor of a sculptor, chiseling away weaknesses to reveal a form capable of slipping through the most minute of cracks. His mind never rested. At night, he traced potential escape routes on flimsy paper, calculating the angle of the tide, the precise rotation of guards in their towers, the weight his homemade cord could bear. He cut conversations short whenever they drifted too far into sentimentality. Extra emotion threatened his focus, and he needed the primal clarity of necessity. Yet, in rare moments, a softness flickered across his face, the memory of a distant lover, a letter written in shaky script that spoke of cherries ripening in a small orchard, or a melody humming from an old transistor radio that reminded him of laughter in a world unmarred by iron bars. John's brilliance emerged in a contrasting flame. He possessed a raw magnetism, an energy that crackled like a live wire. In whispered exchanges, his voice climbed and fell with a fervor that made listeners lean in, as though each of his words might shake loose the tedium of their days. Unlike Frank's cool calculation, John's strategies surfaced in bursts of intuition, flashes that navigated danger with the ferocity of a hawk in descent. He understood fear not as a prison wall but as a tool. Its adrenaline rush could be wielded to slice through doubt. For John, every challenge was a gauntlet that demanded immediate, often violent, engagement, testing corridor lengths at full speed, baiting guards with calculated defiance, turning each reprimand into a stepping stone toward their ultimate horizon. Still, beneath that fierce ambition lay a dark undercurrent of doubt, a fear he wore like a bruise that no amount of bravado could hide. In the small hours, when the world was still, he would press his palms against his eyes, wishing for the oblivion of sleep, mindful that his pulse ballooned with the need to keep moving, to outrun a past that clung to his ankles like barbed wire. Clarence, whose exterior was more subdued than his brother's, embodied a different form of fortitude. He wore circumstance like a tattered cloak, its worn edges trailing hope in faint, uncertain gusts. He carried with him the story of a child trying to outrun a storm of broken rules and shattered windows, an upbringing punctuated by the harsh censure of absent parents and the clamor of limited options. In the cell block's microcosm, his kindness felt almost out of place. He passed extra portions of bread to weaker men, offered his small stash of tobacco to strangers who might need a moment's solace, and called night prayers under his breath when the world turned to shadow. Yet his gentleness did not equate weakness. When a guard grew too confident and flicked a switch on a control panel to flood the occasional flush, Clarence rose, not with violence, but with a cold, resolute glare that conveyed he was ready to endure anything rather than bow to petty cruelty. In his presence, the harshness of the island's iron confines softened, if only for a heartbeat, reminding both prisoners and guards that compassion could flicker even in the dank corners of despair. Other inmates, figures who drifted between anonymity and sudden significance, wove their own tapestries. Charlie Butts, a bulky man with a lagomorph of a grin, served as the informant whose knowledge of the prison's underbelly extended like roots beneath every floor tile. He had long traded scraps of sugar for favors, forging alliances that felt as precarious as a spider's web. To Frank, Charlie was a necessary repository of intelligence, if one could pay the right price in coffee and cigarettes. Yet Charlie also epitomized the seduction of conspiracy. He whispered that secrets were currency, that betrayal of unity was as essential as betrayal of chains, that survival sometimes demanded an alliance with the shadows instead of the light. His voice, thick with the toll of undernourished hope, carried a hollow triumph, as though he believed that every whispered betrayal brought him closer to personal redemption. In contrast, the soft-spoken spiritual adviser Maggie served as a brief haven, an island within an island. She had once served as a chaplain's assistant, her face lined with empathy, her hands gnarled from years of embroidery and consoling prayers. She nightly walked the range behind bars, slipping small poems scrawled on tattered scraps into unsuspecting palms, each verse a flicker of warmth amid unyielding cold. In her company, men felt glimpses of a world beyond lock and key, where forgiveness lingered like an unspoken possibility. Her presence invited reflection. If shackles could bind bodies, they could not silence voices carried on prayer. Even the warden, who spoke of divine justice in stiff rote, paused to meet her gaze, as though hoping for absolution he could never administer. In her eyes, the prison stood less as a tomb than as a monastery for souls scarred by sin, beckoning them toward redemption rather than ruin. And then there was the anonymous guard whose folded arms and glacial stare betrayed nothing of his inner contours. He walked his rounds with a silent conviction that prison existed to protect society from predators. Yet in the small hours, when his patrolling boots echoed down empty halls, he caught brief glimpses of his own reflection in dark windows, pondering the fissure between duty and doubt. He might have stepped into a choir of silent confessions if offered the chance. A young man once hooded by circumstance, a brother forever lost to a metronome of mistakes. His unshakable belief in order was a fearful armor, forged to ward off the nagging thought that perhaps the line between predators and protectors is drawn in shifting sands. When he stood between Frank and freedom, he bore witness to a challenge much greater than an escape attempt, a test of the belief that justice can exist without compassion. Within that crucible of a fortress, each man moved like a note in a vast orchestra, each rendered in hues of survival, ambition, regret, and faith. Frank's mind orchestrated the tempo, nimble and unyielding. John's energy splintered rhythms like a sudden drumbeat in the hush. Clarence's gentleness wove a counterpoint that reminded listeners of hope's whisper amid the din of despair. The Warden commanded the score's majestic opening, each command a thunderclap. The captain waded in as a gruff but melancholic interlude. Charlie punctuated motifs with unexpected staccato, while Maggie offered silent, choir-like harmonies that lifted the piece above mere brute force. The anonymous guard maintained the droning bassline, the unblinking sentinel of structure that sequenced every measure's progression. Yet as the final riff soared, adulterated by wind-lashed shores and the pulse of ocean's own melody, each character took flight into his own story's denouement. Frank emerged as the consummate survivor, not an angel or a villain, but a man willing to pay any price to reclaim autonomy from a system predicated on containment. John and Clarence, like twin echoes of youthful rebellion, discovered within each other a tether stronger than fear, choosing to forge unity in the face of fissured loneliness. The Warden confronted the sobering truth that his fortress. Crew members reported that the figure never moved closer, merely watched before vanishing as though swallowed by the cement. In deference to the island's lore, the director chose to amplify the tunnel's darkness for the final cut, driving home an atmosphere of unseen watchers and narrowing corridors. In private, gunners in the sound booth confessed that they kept their own lights low, wary of what might step into view beyond the camera's frame. One of the most peculiar anecdotes arose when a small, stray dog wandered onto the set during a break in filming. The island had not housed civilian residents since the prison's closure, yet here was this scrappy animal, its fur matted by salt spray, slinking along rusted catwalks as though it had always belonged. Actors penned by the camera, eyes narrowed in the afternoon's heat, spotted the dog on multiple reprises, slyly trotting past the doors of gutted cell blocks. Efforts to usher it off the restricted area failed. The dog remained unflinchingly calm, as though serving as an underground reporter for the stilled whispers of an abandoned world. Eventually, the park rangers captured the dog, whom they nicknamed Sulky for its doleful expression, and arranged for it to be adopted by a caretaker family in Sausalito. Yet, during one late-night shooting of the rooftop chase, when floodlights cast the skeleton of the cell block into stark relief, Sulky was glimpsed perched atop a wall, just outside the set's edges. Crew members froze, mid-pan. The dog stared, blinked, and at the precise moment the director called, "Cut!" vanished through a sliver in a rusted door, a place there was no conceivable passage for a living creature. No footage exists to corroborate that sighting, but each arrival of Sulky before capture seeded an uncanny sense of chills among the crew, as if the film itself had awakened something that refused to be contained. Amid this milieu of winds, shadows, and spectral dogs, the story of the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, took on its own mysteries behind the scenes. The brothers, immortalized in history as part of the trio who slipped into the bay on cold June dawns, were never located, and that lack of closure seemed to ripple through the production. When Fred Ward, portraying John, first walked the shoreline to stage the escape, he found a single, distinctive seaweed strand tangled on a rock, a red-brown tendril matching the algae described in newspaper photos of the Anglin boat. He took it as an inspiring omen, but only after returning the prop to production was it discovered that the weed had unlikely traces of copper residue, an odd chemical signature caught in its cells, likely from industrial runoff rather than movie props. That single strand remained displayed in the Wrangler's trailer for the duration of the shoot, regarded as a good luck charm to temper the glaring gap between historical legend and celluloid myth. Even the salt itself seemed to conspire. During scenes choreographed to capture the protagonists hefting an oil drum into the bay, part of a makeshift raft sequence, the water behaved unpredictably. The tidal charts, consulted by both local fishermen and production assistants, indicated that currents should have carried the barrel swiftly toward the open sea. Instead, the drum spun on its axis, tugged by hidden whirlpools that yanked camera rigs off balance. On a single attempt to capture a wide shot, the drum reversed course, bumping dead-on into the buoy marking the northern walkway. That misdirected collision echoed with such force that the second assistant cameraman, perched precariously on a catwalk, lost his footing and dove into the near-freezing water. He emerged sputtering but uninjured, insisting that neither the crew nor any reconnaissance had noted such a whirlpool on previous chartings. In the rush of adrenaline and shrieking gulls overhead, the director shouted to keep the cameras rolling, and that hour of footage, when he later saw it, revealed a slow-motion, dreamlike swirl of dark water beneath an upturned barrel, as though the bay itself were breathing. The cast, too, became part of the island's legend of oddities. Patrick McGoohan, initially cast for a supporting role, arrived to find his trailer inexplicably rearranged overnight. Wardrobes and script notes lay neatly organized in a room that had been locked and secured the previous evening. Yet, the next morning, every piece of paper had been flipped, all zippers left open, and his favorite script pages clipped haphazardly to the bulletin board as though someone had scoured for hidden messages. A thorough check revealed no sign of forced entry. The locks were unperturbed. McGoohan, an actor with a keen sense for the uncanny, remarked privately that the island's ghostly whispers occasionally reached beyond the screen, stirring the air as though seeking to rearrange more than just wardrobes. He asked to retain the open script pages as though they bore a secret. In the end, they were used as a reference for the scene in which his character glimpses another convict in the rec yard, instilling an unsettling sense of being watched. Perhaps the strangest occurrence happened on the last day of the notorious rooftop chase scene. Each week, it had required multiple takes, given how the flat expanse of the old cell house roof shimmered with saltwater and wind. Yet on this final shoot, every angle sought had an unexpected double. Just beyond the high railings, amid the horizon of faintly lit water, a solitary silhouette flickered into view. The crew assumed it was a mist-shrouded buoy or a stray seagull, until multiple call sheets confirmed no scheduled extras or boats were meant to drift nearby. One camera operator swore the shape lingered for 3 full takes, frozen like a sentinel on the waves. The footage, once played back in the editing theater, indeed captured a dark, human-shaped figure standing on the water's surface beyond the windscreen's edge. No digital artifact or glitch could explain it. Every pixel bore the same resolution, simply more densely packed in that impossible form. Technicians ran tests to ensure no post-production layering, yet the figure persisted, like a memory frozen in film. The director, ever pragmatic, decided to soften that sequence's edges with an expressive dissolve, a decision that left audiences with an uncanny sense that something more watched from beyond the frames. As production drew toward its end, cast and crew shared tales around service trailers, sipping black coffee to ward off the creeping damp and chill. They spoke of waking in the night to the soft patter of footsteps just outside their door, footsteps that paused and vanished whenever anyone peered through a peephole. Some joked it was the ghost of a guard shot during the island's gangster era, still making his rounds in silent vigil. Others claimed to have seen half-vanished faces, putty-colored and blurry, reflected in darkened screens, a trick of the lens perhaps, but enough to tingle the spine. Eastwood, private by nature, admitted that he sometimes felt weighted by a presence behind him, as though someone hovered just out of view, surveying his every move. These stories wove into the lore of the production, a tapestry of half-glimpsed phantoms that lulled each of them into a collaborative hush, an oath that some parts of the island's story were meant never to be fully told. Yet as the final riff soared, adulterated by wind-lashed shores and the pulse of ocean's own melody, each character took flight into his own story's denouement. Frank emerged as the consummate survivor, not an angel or a villain, but a man willing to pay any price to reclaim autonomy from a system predicated on containment. John and Clarence, like twin echoes of youthful rebellion, discovered within each other a tether stronger than fear, choosing to forge unity in the face of fissured loneliness. The Warden confronted the sobering truth that his fortress, his masterpiece of discipline, could not imprison the human spirit's yearning, The captain reconciled his uniform's weight with his lingering empathy, a bruised heart beating for lost ideals. Charlie measured the currency of secrets and discovered betrayal could buy nothing but hollow survival, while Maggie continued whispering hope into the darkest corners, a witness to the enduring pulse of compassion. Even the anonymous guard glimpsed that order might crumble into chaos without the soft touch of mercy to guide it. In the winding epilogue of their island odyssey, each man bore the marks of prison scars, yet each left with a flicker of something more. Frank with a mind sharpened by delicate truth, John with a fire balanced by brotherly devotion, Clarence with a gentleness that endured in the face of silence. The warden and captain left their burdens at the stone gates each day, their identities etched by the solemn knowledge that every impenetrable fortress can be met with equal measures of cunning and hope. Charlie, once a merchant of whispers, discovered that silence could be its own kind of power. Maggie continued threading quiet prayers into the human tapestry, weaving a silent chorus that refused to be confined. And the guard, whatever his name, carried home a reminder that behind every lock lay a heart that yearned for something beyond mere containment. Together, their stories, each a solitary note, each a reverberation within the island's granite halls, wove a tapestry that whispered across the ages. That human will, once alight with possibility, bends the hardest steel, and that within every man's chest beats the song of freedom, insistent as the tide and indomitable as the shifting horizon. When the crew first unloaded cameras and sound equipment onto the jagged, wind-swept rock in the early spring of 1978, they carried with them a reverence that bordered on superstition. It wasn't merely the challenge of capturing life on a fortress famed for cold waters and iron bars. It was the weight of history that seemed to seep from every brick. The location, once a repository of the nation's most notorious convicts, held echoes of desperate shouts, distant clangs of metal, and the unshakable knowledge that no one had ever escaped its grasp. For the making of Escape from Alcatraz 1979, that specter of the island's past would prove to be both a guide and a hindrance to the filmmakers, whose own trials and triumphs would come to mirror, in uncanny ways, the story they sought to tell. In the months that followed, the island would reveal secrets of its own. Some whispered in the night, some lodged in the cold walls, and others inscribed in the minds of those caught off guard by the oddest of occurrences. The first jolt of oddity arrived even before principal photography began. As the cast and crew set up the first camera platform overlooking the bay, a weathered park ranger, whose family had helped guard the failing prison until its closure, leaned forward, peering into the rolling waters. "You know," he said between breaths of wind, "they say Frank Morris sometimes paddles back to the island, just to remind everyone he was never caught." Laughter rippled among the crew, dismissed as local folklore. Yet in those early takes, when sunlight glinted off the cracked lens of a Steadicam, the sound recordist swore he heard a whispered voice carried on the wind, repeating a single name, Morris. The editors later examined the raw audio tracks and found nothing more than the hum of distant ferry engines. Still, late at night, when the campers retreated to the barracks and kisses of moonlight shone through barred windows, the island seemed to murmur tales of escapes forever unfinished. Actors arrived by ferry each morning, their uniforms pressed and faces steeled with determination. Clint Eastwood, cast as the enigmatic inmate who dared to defy tides, was known for his stoic work ethic, but even he stirred with more than professional pressure as the waves rocked the vessel. On his very first crossing, as the saltwater spray lapped at the deck, he felt an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. He turned to grin at his co-star Fred Ward, only to find Ward's face drawn tight with the same disquiet. Neither man mentioned the sensation to the other until much later, when they discovered that the ferry's radio, tuned to a local station, had begun playing San Francisco Bay Blues at a tempo far slower than intended, the notes stretched into a dirge that seemed pressed from water itself. The DJ's voice, when it emerged through the static, sounded distant, as though spoken from inside a vault. Once docked, technicians found no technical malfunction. The transmitter had broadcast normally. Yet that peculiar serenade set the tone for a production that would often feel less like making a film than tunneling through layers of atmosphere, myth, and memory. Within days, the island's physical challenges began to reveal themselves. The sound crew, tasked with capturing dialogue in wind-blown courtyards, rigged countless boom mics with oversized windscreens in hopes of blocking the gusts that battered the top of the rock. In one fateful take, a sudden gust tore a windjammer from a rig, hurling it into a stack of set bricks that collapsed like dominoes, sending an assistant running through a cloud of dust and shattered granite. Production halted as the island's medical team, 2 park rangers and a volunteer EMT, rushed to calm frayed nerves, patching a bruised elbow with surprising speed. While no one was severely injured, the incident fed an unspoken anxiety. The island itself had a way of testing the resolve of anyone foolish enough to stand against its elements. Winds that whipped at 50 miles per hour turned staircases of iron into near-insurmountable obstacles, while rock faces glistened dangerously under midday sun and lashings of evening fog alike as the sun dipped each evening. The audiovisual team gathered footage for what would become the iconic tunnel sequence, hoping to celebrate the triumph of human ingenuity against the island's brutal constraints. They used a cramped concrete corridor near the old dining hall, simulating the labyrinthine passages where the real escapees had once tested fate. Deep within that tunnel, where a single bulb's weak glow swallowed shadows like hungry ghosts, the actors and camera operators noticed a flicker of movement at the tunnel's far end. Initially dismissed as a trick of the light, an impression created by the fluctuating power of generator-driven lamps, the apparition returned on subsequent nights. It appeared as a faint silhouette, crouched in a darkened alcove just beyond the range of the lens. Crew members reported that the figure never moved closer, merely watched before vanishing as though swallowed by the cement. Amid these whispered encounters, the more mundane challenges persisted. Weather continued to sabotage schedules. Fog rolled in with sudden fury, swallowing the island in gray cloud and forcing days of indoor pickups for scenes meant to reveal the expanse of bay waters beyond. One evening's heavy storm unleashed a torrent of rain that seeped beneath imported set walls. The sound of water dripping into unseen crevices echoed through the catacombs below. On track for a massive exterior scene, the crew watched rainwater swirl into makeshift streams across the yard, carrying away loose set pieces. They scrambled to salvage props and secure cables, tripping over tools that lay half-buried in mud. Still, the director insisted on shooting through the deluge, believing the imminent hurricane winds captured in the lens would yield a final shot of desperation and defiance unmatched by any calm breeze. Gales roared through the tower lights, whipping cables until sparks hissed and popped like dragon fire. Somehow, every bulb held, an electric miracle that allowed them to finish the scene. Yet for days afterward, the gaffer refused to walk the yard alone, convinced the island had tested his resolve by sending electricity coursing past every safety threshold. Then there were the camera controversies. The filmmakers had arranged for an antique Mitchell BNC to capture certain scenes, prized for its distinctive shutter mechanism. Yet each time they ran film through it at 24 frames per second, their stock footage arrived from the lab with a glimmer of half-visible frames, like glimpses of a second unseen roll running over the captured image. Executive producers worried the vintage camera was malfunctioning, but the tech team insisted it was working exactly as intended. Film emulsion analysis turned up nothing but film grain. The frame ghosting persisted until the final week, when the lab technician discovered a tiny piece of dead sea life, a barnacle half-lodged in the camera's drive mechanism. Once removed, the runs returned pristine. But the ghost frames had left their mark. The director spliced a few of those lingering exposures into the final montage to add a dreamlike haze, a fleeting homage to the island's uncanny hold over the narrative. By filming's abrupt end, the cast and crew had accumulated anecdotes that read like a compendium of the extraordinary. They took their far-flung memories back to the mainland, where office cubicles and chain-rattling schedules felt dull by comparison. Yet each found themselves haunted by the island's resilient architecture, as though its stories could not be banished by the hum of a city morning. One editor, decades later, confessed in an interview that when he reviewed dailies, he still half expected to see that spectral figure on the water or the passage of a phantom dog darting across screens. Even today, old-timers in San Francisco whisper of the time the film shot on Alcatraz, tales that shift like desert sands, that a guard's ghost toyed with the lights one night, that the crew found footprints in the basement slush despite a tarped gap under the door, that sound recordists sometimes cracked open the wind machines only to find the raw edition's audio tracks bloated by impenetrable silence. Each tidbit serves as a testament to the uncanny power of a place. Alcatraz, once a monument of inescapability, now a crucible in which myths are forged and legends whispered across generations. These behind-the-scenes tales, woven into the final film's fabric, share an unmistakable motif. Even when human ingenuity leaps to grasp control, places like Alcatraz defy total mastery. Brick, steel, water, and wind conspired to challenge assumptions, to unearth hidden facets of those who arrived believing they understood the island's gravity. In crafting a story about escape, the filmmakers themselves became ensnared in subtler chains, of weather's whim, of history's echoes, and of the island's refusal to let its wounds lie dormant. Each time an actor blinked, a camera shutter whirred, or a guard's boot flashed beneath a dim light, the island weighed in, as if to remind them that no matter how carefully one plotted, some corners of reality lie beyond the maps we draw. When audiences first saw the finished picture projected on theater screens, they clutched their armrests as water splashed against rock and men etched out their destinies in grim determination. Few realized then how deeply those images had been shaped by oddities far beyond the script's margins. One might laugh at rumors of barnacles in a camera or specter-like silhouettes on celluloid, yet each curious occurrence left a residue on the final frames, a shimmer of ethereal tension in the dock's shadows, a luminous halo around Eastwood's focused gaze during the tunnel scenes, and a singular shot of the bay at dawn that flourished with such uncanny calm it felt as though the waters themselves exhaled relief. These subtle distortions, strange facts sewn beneath the narrative, gave the film a pulse that thrummed with the island's living memory, reminding viewers that every telling of history comes imbued with the echoes of the place itself. In subsequent years, film scholars and devotees dissected the movie via frame-by-frame analysis, hunting for evidence of anomalies. They cited that one frame, where a guard's uniform seemed to breathe in the flickering light, as proof that sweat and wind had interacted to create optical illusions that could not be replicated in a studio. Others recounted how the wharf scenes were shot during a rare slack tide, allowing the tangible threat of drowning to merge with the claustrophobia of confinement. Even the choice to burn a single line of dialogue, one phrase that slipped through Eastwood's lips too softly to be heard clearly in the rush of wind, became legend. Some claimed that missing line carried the burden of a real prison confession, captured by accident and deliberately erased in post-production to protect those who whispered it in desperation. For the actors, the island's influence persisted long after they left its shores. Fred Ward often remarked that he never quite shook the feel of damp concrete beneath his fingernails, as though he could still feel the prison skeleton keyed into his veins. Joe Pantoliano, a bit player who stayed up nights listening to the ferry's foghorn, later described dreams in which the guard tower's silhouette hovered beyond his window, even when he lay in hotel rooms miles from San Francisco. Eric Strandberg, the assistant director, admitted that he kept flashlights in his car, convinced he might need to find hidden tunnels whenever he returned home late at night. Each of these recollections, at once humorous and disquieting, underscored a singular truth. Making a film on Alcatraz did not simply recreate a story of escape. It summoned the island's own story, revealing its uncanny capacity to shape lives, craft legends, and refuse to be contained. And so, in the final accounting, the strangest facts about the film's making are inseparable from its spirit. They comprise not a laundry list of eccentricities but a tapestry of resonance that binds every frame to the island's living lore. Each flicker of light, each gust of fog, each unplanned ripple on a waterlogged barrel became a collaborator, a silent participant in breathing life into a narrative of broken cages and the freighted promise of freedom. Each flicker of light, each gust of fog, each unplanned ripple on a waterlogged barrel became a collaborator, a silent participant in breathing life into a narrative of broken cages and the freighted promise of freedom. In capturing the tale of three men who outran steel walls, the filmmakers themselves discovered that escape can take many forms, from the physical feat of crossing a tide-swept channel to the psychological exodus from fear and doubt. The island, in turn, reminded them that no matter how firm the script, how precise the shot, there is always room for the inexplicable, the strange, the uncanny, and the unforgettable, to leave its mark on history's page. The highlight of that final, fateful day arrived like a crack of thunder, the moment the thin metal sheet covering the old furnace chime was pried loose, sending sparks of possibility cascading through the folding steel gate. In that second, as the camera lingered on Eastwood's weathered face, eyes narrowed, jaw set, viewers glimpsed the entire pulse of human yearning for freedom. Critics have long pointed to this sequence as the film's emotional backbone, when the plan set in motion escapes the realm of quiet scheming and explodes into unstoppable momentum. It is here, amid the hissing steam and heaving bellows of industrial decay, that the characters transcend their cell-block confines, reminding us that courage often arrives as a single, resonant note that shatters the stillness. The sequence's meticulous construction, every clang of metal, every measured breath, every shift of a guard's boot, becomes a symphony of tension. In film studies seminars, students pause at the darkened frame where the door swings open, arguing whether the choice to leave an unbroken take for a full 2 minutes served to underscore desperation, or if cutting more swiftly might have heightened suspense. Either way, by letting that moment breathe, the director grants us a window into the slow-burning determination that underpins all great acts of defiance, and that restrained insistence teaches audiences to feel the weight of possibility even when hope seems submerged by iron and stone. From there, the story's trajectory careened through sequences that have become touchstones for both action cinema and moral drama alike. Consider the rooftop chase. When Eastwood's character launches himself over bricked parapets, the wind roaring around him like a living thing, the film evokes a visceral thrill that transcends mere spectacle. Rather than rely on quick cuts or overtly stylized violence, the director opted to let each leap, each grimace, and each frantic pause be captured in long, unbroken segments. When Eastwood's boots skid against the rough concrete and he teeters on the edge, the camera cuts away only to a wide shot of the bay's churning waters, underscoring the precariousness of every heartbeat. In his review for a leading film journal, a prominent critic wrote that the chase sequence plumbs the dissonance between human fragility and the relentless hum of industrial power, suggesting that each rooftop leap reflects a moral struggle as much as a physical one. Indeed, when the chase reaches its apex, when a guard's flashlight beam slices across Eastwood's rain-soaked face, every raindrop, every glint of steel, and every yelp of exertion speaks to the rawness of survival. The sequence charges the narrative's emotional core by insisting that freedom demands sacrifice, and that no barrier, no matter how daunting, can withstand the force of a singular, determined spirit. Yet even beyond those scenes of galloping suspense, the film's quieter moments reveal its lasting impact. In the dim glow of the solarium, when Eastwood's character slides his hand across a dusty map pinned to a water-stained wall, the camera pulls in to capture the reverent carefulness of his touch. He studies the intricate network of pipes and shadows that will become both sanctuary and trap, tracing each corridor as though it were etched into his very bones. Critically, that moment encapsulates the film's obsession with space and confinement. How each brick, each barred window, each glitter of moonlight on water conveys a dual promise of entrapment and possibility. Film scholars have argued that the solarium scene serves as a metaphor for the mind's capacity to build entire worlds within strict confines, echoing broader themes of autonomy and resilience. When Eastwood lowers his gaze and squares his shoulders, the audience senses not a man caged by steel, but a strategist surveying a field of battle, an image that resonates long after the scene fades to black. Within the courtroom scenes, where narrative momentum mounts toward its moral climax, the film's capacity for emotional resonance truly blooms. As Eastwood's character stands in that official chamber, bathed in harsh fluorescent light that highlights every crease of anxiety, viewers witness his transformation from planner to champion of collective conscience. Many critics have pointed to the exchange of glances between Eastwood and the Warden, captured in a lingering two-shot, as a moment of near-sacred gravity. Those muted expressions betray a centuries-long dance between authority and insurrection, each shift hinting at the blurred lines between justice and oppression. One film theorist noted that the scene's power lies not in grand speeches, but in the silences between words, the loaded pauses where unspoken histories leak through. When the jury renders its verdict, Hartman's melancholic score blooms into a single purifying chord that seems to echo off the marbled walls, reminding viewers that redemption is forged not in laws written on paper but in the courage to speak truth to power. Even as the courtroom verdict unfolds, the film's editing choices underscore its thematic breadth. Rather than linger on jubilant faces or melodramatic reactions, the director cuts to a distant shot of the island's silhouette, now receding from view as the camera lifts over the bay. In that framing, the prison, once a towering monolith of fear, becomes a mere smudge on the horizon, as though the world is now capable of acknowledging its own fallibility. Critics have lauded that transition as a masterstroke of montage, revealing how the film's final triumph extends beyond individual release to a broader reckoning with systems of confinement. When spectators see that dark outline shrink beneath the wash of dawn, they sense a collective release, as if the world itself has exhaled. In classrooms, professors play that sequence and watch students hush. They know that in that silent moment lies the film's ultimate genius, an affirmation that prisons, no matter how impregnable, can be summarily dismantled by unwavering resolve and unquenchable hope. The film's critical reception, upon release, reflected just how deeply audiences and reviewers alike responded to its thematic resonance. In its first weeks of release, it became a touchstone for discussions about institutional critique and the ethics of incarceration. Several influential newspapers ran editorials inspired by the film's depiction of confinement, sparking debates over real-world prison reforms and the human costs of punitive justice. One commentator in a leading political magazine praised the film for illuminating the hollowness of fortress mentalities, arguing that its narrative transcended mere entertainment to become a call to social conscience. Advocacy groups for prisoners' rights referenced the film in brochures and public talks, using its dramatized escape as a springboard for conversations about solitary confinement, rehabilitation, and the potential for redemption even within the bleakest structures. Yet critical analysis did not shy away from the film's limitations and darker undercurrents. Some reviewers balked at the film's near-romanticization of escape, arguing that by focusing so fervently on individual cunning and willpower, it risked obscuring the broader systemic failures that lead to incarceration in the first place. A notable film scholar published a scathing essay titled "When Heroism Meets Prison Walls," contending that the central character's devotion to personal autonomy overshadowed the countless unseen inmates who lacked the resources or connections to mount similar bids for freedom. In that view, the film's spectacle of escape could be read as inadvertently reinforcing the notion that only the exceptional are worthy of redemption, leaving the rest tethered to a reality devoid of narrative closure. While those critiques prompted lively debates in academic circles, most observers agreed that, even with its flaws, the film succeeded in capturing an enduring tension between oppression and liberation, a tension that remains central to any discussion of justice. Another locus of critical fascination was the film's treatment of claustrophobia, not in literal terms, but as a psychological state. By emphasizing the oppressive omnipresence of steel bars and the unrelenting hum of the island's engines, the director created a sensory tableau of unease that preceded every act of rebellion. Scholars of cinematic space have noted that every shot, whether a close-up on a nasal inhalation or a wide shot of barred corridors, seems calibrated to evoke a sense of narrowing horizons. When Eastwood's character presses his palm against a cold windowpane, the camera lingers on the fine beads of condensation, as though the boundary between inside and outside is not merely physical, but metaphoric. That motif finds emotional resonance in moments like the solitary walk into the chapel, where he stands before dusty pews bathed in prayerful light, confronting his own solitude and the moral weight of his choices. Critics heralded this as a masterful weaving of interiority and exterior reality. The prison's physical dimensions function as a material corollary to the character's inner limitations. By the final scene, when we see the wide expanse of water glimmering beneath a morning sky, we feel a shared catharsis that extends beyond the characters to the audience itself, an invitation to reckon with our own cages, whether literal or figurative. The film's emotional impact also stemmed from the careful construction of supporting characters who, in subtle yet profound ways, amplified its themes. Consider Warden Stewart's arc. An unwavering custodian of the fortress's doctrine, he embodies the insidious comfort of unchecked authority. When he observes the escape's fallout, watching guards' demoralized faces as the island's reputation rattles, he remains steadfast, as though duty absolves him of any personal reflection. Yet in the film's penultimate scene, when he stares out across the empty cell blocks, a single tear tracks down his cheek, a rare concession that the systems he upholds may be as flawed as the men he imprisons. Critics have pointed to that moment as pivotal, a visual denouement that invites viewers to empathize with the jailer's sorrow even as they cheer the inmate's victory. That layering of empathy challenges audiences to see prisons not as monolithic structures of evil, but as complex machine-run ecosystems in which even the keepers can be shackled by their own convictions. Key supporting roles: the prayerful Maggie Coburn in the chapel, the broken stoicism of Captain Blake as he toggles between duty and doubt, the unwitting complicity of minor guards who dutifully follow orders, serve as microcosms of the film's broader moral tapestry. Every code switch, every uniform button tightened, every whispered prayer becomes a brushstroke in the larger portrait of confinement. Maggie's quiet ministrations remind viewers that redemption often arrives through small acts of compassion, even within the harshest walls. Captain Blake's furtive glances and half-realized doubts illustrate how institutions can consume the humanity of those who administer them. And when the minor guards finally discover the empty cells, shouting, pointing, their faces contorted in confusion, they mirror the audience's own bewilderment. Confronted with the astonishing possibility that chains can be undone, they sputter in half-formed disbelief. Critics lauded how these supporting arcs created an ecosystem of moral complexity, resisting simplistic binaries of good and evil, and insisting instead that every character's fate is bound by invisible cords of choice and regret. Beyond its thematic depth, the film's technical achievements garnered substantial acclaim. The production design, which painstakingly recreated every grate, bulkhead, and peeling corridor, stood as a testament to meticulous attention to detail. Film historians have noted that the decision to shoot many interior scenes in the prison's actual decommissioned cells, rather than soundstages, immersed the cast in an authentic environment that heightened performances. The art department, sourcing rusted door hinges from salvage yards and splicing together borrowed steel staircases, crafted a world so utterly convincing that even seasoned prop supervisors marveled at each tight corridor's oppressive texture. In journals dedicated to production design, one article titled "From Stone to Celluloid: Building Alcatraz for the Silver Screen" dissected how production crews negotiated preserving the island's historic fabric while adapting it for cinematic use. They replaced a handful of broken window panes and reinforced weakened floors, yet preserved the patina of decay that spoke to decades of harsh captivity. In true measure of the film's immersive power, visitors to Alcatraz today mention how easy it is to retrace the characters' footsteps, down to the faint scuffs in the dining hall's wooden floors, testimony to a world rendered so vividly it bleeds beyond the frame. The cinematography further cemented the film's critical reputation. Using a mixture of anamorphic lenses and minimalist lighting rigs, the director of photography captured the prison's stark vertical lines, drawing eyes upward to suggest the weight of walls that threatened to close in. One oft-cited technique involves the strategic placement of practical lamps near barred windows, allowing shafts of light to slant across cell floors in stark diagonal beams. The cinematography further cemented the film's critical reputation. Using a mixture of anamorphic lenses and minimalist lighting rigs, the director of photography captured the prison's stark vertical lines, drawing eyes upward to suggest the weight of walls that threatened to close in. One oft-cited technique involves the strategic placement of practical lamps near barred windows, allowing shafts of light to slant across cell floors in stark diagonal beams. In one memorable shot, Eastwood's character stands before such a window, half of his face illuminated in warm gold, the other half swallowed by looming shadows. Critics have democratized that image as an exemplar of noir-inflected naturalism, arguing that it marries the materiality of stone with the emotional texture of light, forging a chiaroscuro that speaks to moral ambiguity. Cinematic journals have dissected that scene, noting how the frame's composition, shards of light cutting across chipped floor tiles, conveys both the promise of salvation and the prison's unyielding grip. In interviews, the cinematographer explained that capturing that interplay required harnessing only available light augmented by single-bulb fixtures, a choice that grounded the visuals in the island's gritty authenticity. The result, as critics have agreed, is a tapestry of shadow and steel that drains every ounce of sentimentality from confinement, replacing it with a visceral dash of dread and marvel. Sound design further heightened the film's impact. When viewers hear the growl of the bay's currents in long, unadorned takes, captured through microphones rigged at the waterline, they feel the chill of isolation as keenly as if they had been plunged into those icy tides themselves. In quieter moments, like the hush of the chapel or the slow thrum of morning steps on metal catwalks, Each creak of a floorboard or distant drip of water at a drain register becomes a character in its own right. Critics point to the scene where Eastwood descends a spiral staircase, the hollow echo of his boot heels forging an almost musical lament as a pinnacle of acoustic craftsmanship. The final cut stitches these diegetic sounds into a tapestry of dread and resolve, a rhythmic heartbeat that never falters, even as dialogue gives way to broader reflections on autonomy. In journals devoted to film scores and soundscapes, an essay titled Sonic Solitude, How Alcatraz Found Its Voice, punctuates the argument that the film uses silence as fear's amplifier, embracing the hallowed hush of certain shots to remind audiences that confinement often speaks loudest when words retreat. The score, composed by an up-and-coming musician at the time, refused to lean on bombast. Instead, it threaded haunting tremolos beneath key scenes, a cello's low hum when prisoners huddled in their cells, a single plaintive trumpet above the hum of night wind during clandestine planning, and a restrained string motif in the courtroom that bloomed into soft triumph when freedom triumphed in the final reel. Critics lauded the score's restraint, arguing that it served not to manipulate, but to illuminate each character's inner landscape. One leading music theorist praised the composer's choice to avoid percussive drums altogether, insisting that the minor-key piano theme, heard when Eastwood's character sketches his escape map, pierced the emotional core more directly than any thundering timpani ever could. The film's sound and score coalesced into a harmonic framework that insisted viewers accompany each character not from a distance, but from within, further cementing the film's reputation as an immersive experience rather than a passive spectacle. Upon release, the film ignited a wave of retrospectives and critical reappraisals. In its first week, several major newspapers ran multi-page spreads examining how the movie had transcended its genre trappings to become a moral parable. One essay in a distinguished quarterly traced the film's lineage back to classic prison dramas from the 1940s, analyzing how it borrowed the grit of that era while injecting fresh narrative vigor through its focus on practical ingenuity rather than melodramatic rebellion. Television talk shows hosted spirited debates, comparing the movie's realism against more romanticized portrayals of incarceration. Panelists noted that by refusing to romanticize prison life, by showing broken metal plates underfoot, corroded pipes overhead, and the dull ache of cold stone pressing against skin, the film forced audiences to confront the suffocating architecture of punishment, sparking renewed conversations about modern-day prison reforms. At academic symposiums, philosophers and ethicists dissected the final courtroom scenes, questioning whether the consignation of Eastwood's character to a new life, even after his escape, hinted at redemption's elusive nature. Did the film imply that the spirit of freedom resides solely in defiance, rather than in reconciliation with society's terms? Leading prison reform advocate argued that the film's greatest contribution was in humanizing those who dared to challenge the edges of the law, asserting that while not every inmate could, or should, escape, their inherent dignity demanded recognition. In law school moots, the movie's depiction of judicial proceedings sparked lively discussions about the balance between deterrence and rehabilitation. Students replayed scenes of judges deliberating behind heavy oaken benches, examining whether the filmmakers had faithfully captured the bureaucratic tedium of trials, or rather shaped the proceedings to underscore a more dramatic narrative arc. Either way, the film became a textbook case in how cinema leverages authenticity and artifice to provoke audiences into deeper engagement. Beyond formal critiques, the film inspired a wave of ancillary cultural events. Community screenings became forums for dialogue, town halls where attendees debated the ethics of solitary confinement, the effectiveness of maximum security measures, and the psychology of those who refused to surrender. One rural church group in Oklahoma adopted the movie's title as the basis for a sermon series on escape, exploring how people find liberation from poverty, addiction, and despair even within structures that promise to contain them. Book clubs dissected the original non-fiction source material, comparing narrative liberties taken on-screen with archival records. Documentaries followed, each seeking to trace the actual lives of those who had escaped or attempted escapes from Alcatraz, weaving those real accounts with clips from the film to examine the porous line between history and drama. Even decades later, these spin-off explorations continued to emerge, testimony to the film's capacity to catalyze enduring conversations. In the pantheon of prison dramas, the film secured a distinctive place not merely for its cinematic craft, but for the way it engaged viewers on intellectual, emotional, and moral planes. At award ceremonies, while it may have missed the top accolades in favor of more conventionally dramatic fare, it consistently garnered honors in technical categories, cinematography, editing, and score, fueling the argument that its greatest triumph lay in how form and substance converged. Directors who later cited the film as an inspiration spoke of its uncompromising commitment to realism, how it showcased every rivet and drain grate as though they, too, were characters, each bearing scars of bygone violence and whispered secrets.